What happens when the world's most fearless shock jock ends up face to face with the most emotionally sensitive royal of the modern era? Howard Stern and Prince Harry crossed paths inside a serious studio, and what followed became a psychological dismantling no amount of media coaching could have prepared for. Howard Stern built a billion-dollar empire by crushing celebrity egos, creating a career around saying the things polite society usually avoids. And not once has he ever apologized for it. Prince Harry, seated on the other side of that studio glass, had spent years building a multi-million-dollar fortress of privacy and protection, only to tear it down repeatedly whenever cameras switched on and checks started arriving. Harry walked in assuming this was another routine promotional appearance, an opportunity to discuss healing and promote his newest project. But Howard Stern doesn't do healing. He does interrogations, and Harry was about to learn that lesson firsthand. The tension was already there before a microphone even switched on. Harry didn't simply arrive at the studio. He entered it like an operation was underway, surrounded by security personnel, PR representatives, and legal advisors carrying folders packed with restricted topics, which effectively summarized most of his life. No questions about his brother. Nothing involving his father's health. No mention of the spare title. And absolutely no discussion about the financial details behind his Hollywood arrangements. For most interviewers, a list like that serves as a courtesy. To Howard Stern, it looked more like a challenge. He glanced through it, smirked toward his producer, and tossed it straight into the trash. Harry was stepping directly into a trap while believing he had been welcomed into a safe environment. When Harry finally sat down, the contrast alone painted the picture. Before anyone spoke, dressed in his trademark California casual look, appearing every bit the modern humanitarian prince, he found himself across from a man whose appearance and attitude had barely changed in 4 decades. The studio carried that distinct, compressed silence that always seems to arrive right before something goes terribly wrong. Harry opened with a rehearsed smile, clearly expecting the usual soft introductions about charity work and streaming projects that tend to dominate his interviews. Stern skipped the pleasantries entirely. Less than 30 seconds in, he asked Harry whether he understood that much of the American public had become exhausted by what felt like a constant poor me narrative, and how someone born into the highest level of global privilege could spend so much time expressing grievances while living inside a $14 million mansion. Harry's polished media expression slipped for just a brief moment, and that tiny crack became the first indication that things were heading somewhere dangerous. Harry quickly reached for his familiar authenticity talking points, leaning into arguments that mental health struggles don't care about titles or financial status. A compelling point on its own. But Stern wasn't there to debate psychology. What interested him was what he called the Sussex business model. He pressed Harry about the nonstop stream of content, Netflix projects, podcasts, the memoir, endless interviews. Then came the question that landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. At what point does sharing your truth become a financial strategy designed to maintain a lifestyle that's become too expensive to sustain? Harry's handlers visibly shifted, calculating whether this was the moment to shut everything down. But Harry stayed seated, calling Stern cynical while frustration slowly built behind his eyes. Inside Howard Stern's studio, there has only ever been one person controlling the room. Harry was beginning to realize exactly who that was. The interview moved from uncomfortable into outright brutal. The moment the discussion turned toward trauma, a concept that had become central to Harry's public. What happened next stunned even the experienced production team. Stern reached for the final forbidden topic. He invoked the memory of Princess Diana, not as a tribute, but as part of his argument against her own son. Stern claimed Diana had chosen to remain inside the system and fight for causes she cared about, while Harry had walked away the moment things became difficult. Then came the line that landed like an explosion. Aunt Diana would be ashamed of what Harry had made of his life. Harry reacted instantly. Raw, immediate, and uncontrolled. He shouted that Stern had absolutely no right to speak her name. The intensity of it seemed to catch everyone inside the studio off guard. Stern didn't retreat. He met him head on, telling Harry point blank that this was his show and he would say exactly what he believed. It was complete unscripted chaos, the kind of moment that lives online forever. Harry finally reached his breaking point when it became obvious he was trapped in a fight where his title carried no authority and his victim narrative wasn't gaining sympathy. He stood up suddenly, chair dragging loudly across the floor, and announced that the interview was over. But before Harry reached the exit, Stern fired one final shot. If he truly hated being royal so much, Stern asked, why continue using the Duke of Sussex title? Why not give it up entirely if privacy was genuinely the goal? The silence afterward lasted longer than anything spoken during the previous hour. Harry opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He pulled off his headphones, hurled them across the room, and the sound of plastic striking the wall became the official ending to his attempt at conquering New York media. Within minutes, the audio spread across the internet, and audiences divided into opposing camps. But for the first time, a sizable portion found themselves siding with Stern. He had spoken aloud what many people had spent years quietly thinking, exposing what they saw as a gap between privilege and grievance, and questioning whether pain itself had become part of a business model. For Harry, walking out didn't come across as a powerful statement. It looked like a public relations disaster. He arrived intending to promote a documentary and left appearing like a man who folded under one difficult hour of questioning. Reports from sources close to the palace suggested the embarrassment traveled across the Atlantic, with serious discussions emerging over whether this represented another major setback in Harry's attempt to reshape his image in America. Back in the studio, Howard and Robin broke down the fallout with the detached precision of surgeons reviewing a procedure. Stern remarked that he'd seen prank callers display more composure. And he predicted that the moment marked the beginning of the end for Sussex relevance in Hollywood, arguing that American audiences sympathize with victims up until those victims begin sounding like complainers. In Stern's eyes, Harry had crossed that line publicly and permanently. One man walked away from that confrontation looking stronger than when he entered. The other somehow looked more like a spare than he ever had back in London. In that image, a prince standing silent inside a New York radio studio, unable to defend the title he still carried, isn't the kind of moment people forget quickly. Howard Stern didn't just conduct an interview. He peeled back the image. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because the fallout from this confrontation keeps evolving by the hour, with reports now pointing toward private meetings happening behind palace doors. This is one of those stories unfolding in real time, and we're following every development. The spare may have walked out of the building, but the impact of that exit is still echoing far beyond New York. The entire structure Harry and Meghan built in Montecito was always grounded in one central idea, that they could preserve every advantage of royal life while leaving behind the obligations and criticism attached to it. Stern tore that premise apart in less than an hour by applying the one standard that eventually catches up to everyone. Once you put your life on display, you lose the right to decide who gets to examine it. Harry's mistake wasn't accepting the interview. His mistake was stepping into that studio still believing his title placed him under a different set of rules than everyone else. Now back inside his mansion, recovering from what his team will almost certainly frame as another traumatic experience, he leaves behind a public image that barely resembles the one he walked in with. Stern's prediction that the Sussex era may be drifting toward irrelevance carries more weight coming from him than it would from most people. A victim narrative, no matter how carefully managed, has limits when it's expected to support a multi-million-dollar operation. Once the mystery fades, the structure becomes harder to sustain. Remove the palace scenery, strip away the protection of the crown, and what's left is another celebrity couple fighting for attention in a market already overflowing with people trying to do exactly the same thing. After New York, the viral moments may continue generating views and headlines, but increasingly for reasons that work against the brand they've spent years trying to build. And financially, this is where the story becomes significantly darker. Streaming companies like Netflix don't simply look for content. They want content that holds audiences without dragging public relations disasters along with it. And when Stern described Harry as a C-list celebrity with unresolved daddy issues, those words didn't disappear once they left the airwaves. They landed inside executive boardrooms where people oversee contracts worth millions. A public figure seen as someone who exits the room as soon as questions become uncomfortable represents a real business risk. Industry insiders are already talking about relevance check discussions where executives are reportedly treating Sussex fatigue not as tabloid noise, but as measurable data. The planned 2026 Australian tour had been expected to serve as the engine driving their next wave of deals and content opportunities. And if that project shrinks or disappears altogether, the financial structure surrounding it becomes unstable at an alarming speed. None of these conversations exist in isolation, either because they closely mirror what Tom Bauer documented in his investigative work, where he described a Sussex operation built around media management and aggressively controlling criticism. Whether Stern intended it or not, he ended up validating parts of that account in real time. By refusing to follow the approved script, Stern pulled the curtain back on the polished humanitarian image and exposed a version critics had long claimed existed underneath, an angrier, more entitled figure described in detail by Bauer, which meant the confrontation served two purposes simultaneously: a radio interview and a live-action confirmation of some of the book's sharpest accusations. The result has created a pincer effect, squeezing the Sussex brand from both directions at once. Back in Montecito during the interview, sources reportedly described the atmosphere as absolute chaos. Meghan, whose entire professional strategy centers around controlling messaging in presentation, was said to be horrified watching her husband take personal shots at a radio host live on air, and because in that single moment, one of their core claims collapsed entirely: the idea that they control their own story. You can't present yourselves as the authors of your narrative when a shock jock sitting inside a glass studio is writing the story for you. And according to the rumors now circulating through Hollywood, the power couple image may have suffered real structural damage. Maintaining the appearance of global leadership becomes far more difficult when your partner just delivered what many people are calling the most viral public collapse in serious STEM history. Which brings us back to the biggest question: why agree to the interview in the first place? Because the answer may be the most revealing part of this entire story. Howard Stern's ability to be ruthless has never been hidden. Anyone familiar with his history already knows exactly what happens when guests arrive, overconfident or unprepared. The fact that Harry's team accepted the booking anyway points towards something more serious than simple bad judgment. Suggests a brand under real pressure. A brand willing to enter the one room it couldn't control because the invitations from the A-list had already started drying up. Working royals don't sit down with Howard Stern. Senior diplomats don't sit down with Howard Stern. That chair usually gets filled by people trying to move a product. And Harry walked into that studio trying to sell a version of himself that the market may have already started discounting. The psychological aftermath of this interview may take a long time to fully understand, because what Stern achieved wasn't simply the act of tearing someone apart. What he delivered was a public dismantling of a royal identity, exposing the possibility that once the titles, palaces, and institutional structure Harry so often criticizes are removed, the person underneath no longer seems entirely sure who he actually is. The spare identity, as it turned out, may never have been something forced onto him by the monarchy at all. Harry appeared to absorb that role so deeply that he required an opponent to define himself against. And once his father and brother no longer occupied that position in his public story, he seemed to cast Stern into it instead. But Stern had been doing this far too long. He was too quick, too experienced, and saw the move before it fully happened. Before Harry understood what was unfolding, Stern had already turned the mirror around and pointed it back in his direction. Now, attention shifts toward the planned 2026 Australian Redemption Tour, where organizers in Canberra and Sydney are reportedly exploring ways to distance the event from the explosive image they projected in New York. Some discussions have even reportedly touched on a far more dramatic possibility, whether Harry should appear without using his titles at all. And that creates a problem with no easy escape route. Giving up the titles means letting go of the last remaining piece of institutional authority still attached to him. Keeping them means reinforcing Stern's accusation of hypocrisy in front of a global audience. By most reports, the Sussex team now appears trapped inside precisely this dilemma, caught between two choices where either outcome risks validating the very criticism they are trying hardest to reject. And when the final scorecard of Stern versus Sussex is eventually written, there may not be any clean victors. Stern got his viral moment. But in doing so, he also revealed a level of ruthlessness that unsettled even some of his longtime supporters. Harry got his authentic moment too. But the authenticity that surfaced painted the image of a man running on fumes and operating in waters far deeper than he was prepared for. What audiences ultimately walked away with, however, may have been the clearest picture yet. Appears to have run out of momentum. And what remains is the story of two people who believed they could reshape global attention on their own terms, only to discover that the world had already moved on and was now mostly watching to see where they landed.